Well, I'd like to continue our discussion of the second coming of Christ in our lectures in Christian Doctrine by Dr. Joe Sprinkle by doing a bit of historical theology, looking at some historical perspectives on this doctrine, a doctrine which is recorded as early as the Nicene Creed. From there, he will come to judge the living and the dead. How has the church developed various views on the return of Jesus Christ and its relationship to the millennium or the 1,000 years of Revelation 20? Apocalyptic and eschatological writings in the Bible have suffered more at the hands of their interpreters than any other portion of Scripture, resulting in a great deal of irresponsible speculation. So, how can we sort all that out? Well, in the ante-Nicene period, that's the period before the Nicene Creed was written, you had a view called Chiliasm or millenarianism. Philip and David Schaff, who write on church history, say this: the most striking point in the eschatology of the ante-Nicene age was the prominent Chiliasm or millenarianism, is that the belief of a visible reign of Christ in glory on earth with the risen saints for 1,000 years before the general resurrection and judgment. It was indeed not the doctrine of the church embodied in any creed or form of devotion, but a widely current opinion of distinguished teachers such as Barnabas, Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Methodius, and Lactantius, while Caius, Origen, Dionysius the Great, Eusebius, and afterwards Jerome and Augustine opposed it. Now, this Chiliasm is the same thing as premillennialism in a later time. Chiliasm or millennialism is called today historic premillennialism. It says that there will be a tribulation at the end of the age and that there would be a 1,000-year earthly reign of Christ on earth before the last judgment. And the second coming was also associated with the appearance of the Antichrist. Irenaeus says this about the Antichrist: when this Antichrist shall have devastated all things in the world, he will reign for 3 years and 6 months and sit in the temple at Jerusalem. And then the Lord will come from heaven in the clouds in the glory of the Father, sending this man and those who follow him into the lake of fire. That's Irenaeus, who died around 202 of the Christian era. Other early proponents of Chiliasm include Papias, who believe, quote, that there will be a period of 1,000 years after the resurrection from the dead when the kingdom of Christ will be set up in material form on this earth. And then there is Justin Martyr, who says, I and others who are right-minded Christians on all points are assured that there will be a resurrection of the dead and 1,000 years in Jerusalem, which will then be built and adorned and enlarged. But he didn't consider this belief to be a key element of Orthodox Christian doctrine, because he does note in saying this that, quote, many who belong to the pure and pious faith and are true Christians think otherwise. So there was always a divergent point of view even in Justin Martyr's day concerning this Chiliasm or millennialism, but nonetheless he held to a historic premillennial point of view. Premillennialists interpreted the Old Testament prophecy quite literally, combined with their belief in the millennium. And they emphasize the earthly blessings of Christians who would enjoy these things in the millennium. According to Papias, who is quoted actually by other writers, his writings themselves have not survived. But according to Papias, quote, the days will come when vines will grow, each having 10,000 shoots, on each shoot 10,000 branches, and on each branch 10,000 twigs, on each twig 10,000 clusters, and in each cluster will yield 25 measures of wine. Similarly, a grain of wheat will produce 10,000 heads, and every head will have 10,000 grains, and every grain 10 pounds of fine flour, white and clean. And the other fruits, seeds, and grass will produce in similar proportions. Now, historic premillennialists were not like dispensational premillennialists today. They believed that Christ came after the Great Tribulation to rapture the church, to have the people alive meet the Lord in the air, not before the Great Tribulation, which is what dispensational premillennialists believe. And thus, they were what we today would have called post-tribulationalist premillennialists. Now, before the Nicene Creed, there was also amillennialism that was taught. Justin Martyr observed that not all Christians who belonged to the true and pious faith accepted the premillennialism that he believed, and some of these were apparently amillennialists. That is, they believed that the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 occurs concurrently with the church age. Now, the excesses of the Chilias in emphasizing the luxurious wealth and material blessing during the millennium seemed a bit too this worldly to a church that was increasingly celebrating monastic asceticism. And the rise of allegorical interpretation in the Alexandrian school of Origen and Clement contributed to the non-literal interpretation of the book of Revelation and other apocalyptic writings. Now, after the Nicene Creed, over time, amillennialism won out in the church. Again, amillennialism literally means no millennium, in a sense of no millennium like the Chilias believed. Augustine established the amillennial interpretation of Revelation 20. He linked the binding of Satan for 1,000 years in Revelation 22, verses 2 and 3, with Jesus' words about the binding of the strong man in Mark chapter 3 and verse 27. And thus the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 is not a general event after the second coming, but according to amillennialists such as Augustine, it is concurrent with the present age. In the Middle Ages and on through the Reformation, amillennialism was the reigning point of view. Now, there was a 12th century monk by the name of Joachim of Fior who took an eccentric view that somewhat resembles millennialism. He divided the prophetic history into the age of the Father, the age of the Son, at the end of which the Antichrist would be released, and the age of the Spirit. The Catholic Church, and explicitly Thomas Aquinas, rejected Fior's point of view. There was a small revival of premillennialism among some Anabaptists. The Anabaptists were Protestants who rejected infant baptism and demanded that people be rebaptized as adult believers. Calvin held these Chilias in contempt. He remarks contemptuously, "This fiction is too puerile to need to deserve refutation." Luther also rejected millennialism, though he did emphasize the church's hope of the second coming of Christ, even thinking that this might happen in his own lifetime. Quote, "It's my firm belief that the angels are getting ready, putting on their armor and girding their swords about them, for the last day is already breaking, and the angels are preparing for the battle when they will overthrow the Turks," that would be the Muslims, "and hurl them along with the Pope to the bottom of hell. The world will perish shortly." During Luther's day, there was a rebellion of people that had come to this premillennial point of view that helped to discredit them. This rebellion took place in 1534 and 1535. These Anabaptists, now they're called Mennonites, were usually pacifists, but there was a group in northwestern Germany stirred by fiery sermons, engaged in the Munster Rebellion of 1534-1535, and they were inspired by apocalyptic expectations and prophetic visions that the New Jerusalem would descend on Munster, and they tried to bring this about by human effort through their rebellion, though their rebellion was crushed militarily. And this discredited, for the time being, premillennialism among Lutherans. There arose yet another point of view called postmillennialism, promoted by Anglican theologian Daniel Whitby, died in 1726, and Calvinist preacher, theologian, philosopher Jonathan Edwards, who died in 1758. These argued that Christ returns to judge the world after or post the millennium of Revelation chapter 20. Postmillennialism in most ways is similar to amillennialism. Postmillennialism thrived in the late 18th and early 19th century, defended by Baptist theologian Augustus Strong in his Systematic Theology in 1907. But postmillennialism is not nearly so strong or so common today, though you run into it from time to time. Then there comes the revival of premillennialism. Calvinist theologian and encyclopedia writer Johann Heinrich Alsted, died in 1638, defended premillennialism through a detailed interpretation of Revelation 20. And little by little, more Protestants began to follow this view, though it remained a small movement. It didn't become really popularized until this man, John Nelson Darby, came up with a form of it which we call dispensational premillennialism. John Nelson Darby, founder of the Plymouth Brethren movement, argued in favor of the premillennial view with his own twist that makes it distinctively called dispensationalism. Dispensational premillennialist teaches that the church has not replaced Israel as the people of God, but that God still has separate programs for both Israel and the church, and that the church would be caught up with Christ in the air, an event called the secret rapture, and would be removed to heaven immediately before the period of the 7-year period of the Great Tribulation, according to Darby and his followers. And thus he divided human history into 7 time periods or dispensations, concluding with the millennium as the last stage of this. Unlike historic premillennialism, which is post-tribulation, that is, Christ returns after the troubles before the millennium, this view was pre-tribulational. Christ comes before the tribulation to remove the church, and then comes again after the tribulation to establish the millennial kingdom. In a sense, there's 2 second comings of Christ in this point of view. And there have been many proponents of this dispensational premillennialism. You have William Blackstone in the 19th century, who wrote a book, Jesus is Coming, in 1878. Dwight Moody, founder of the Moody Bible Institute, was a dispensational premillennialist. C.I. Scofield, who edited the Scofield Reference Bible of 1909, was a dispensational premillennialist. Louis Sperry Schaeffer was of the same theology. John Walvoord was a 20th century proponent of the view. Tim LaHaye, who wrote the Left Behind series, was a proponent of the view. And Hal Lindsey remains a proponent of this view. Hal Lindsey wrote a famous book called The Late Great Planet Earth, where he describes it and popularizes the view in his own way.